Good morning. Before you panic, we're going to take up Kant, but I'm going to try to make the relationship between Kant, Hegel, and Schleiermacher a matter of more ready access. I'm not going to try to pretend that we can get through everything all at the same time, but we can get the basics. Remember that Kant was critical of the various forms of observational rationality and tried to show that they wound up in illusionary consequences. If you were an empiricist, you couldn't talk about yourself. If you were a rationalist, you're running around somewhere in the heavens without any grounding. And Kant said this is all illusional. So he began with an analysis of the centrality of the human subject. So it becomes anthropocentric. And he writes the first philosophical anthropology. So the way in which humans do their knowing shapes the way in which they receive the world. I'm going to say that again. The way in which humans do their knowing shapes the way in which they receive their world. We have no access to the world as it is. We simply filter it through our ways of knowing. Kant concluded that what this meant was that we are able to think through our ways of knowing, and in one instance, our natural everyday knowledge, our theoretical knowledge, our knowledge of the sensible world, is governed by rules so that whenever we experience the world, we experience it in the same way. The trees stay up, the water doesn't dump out of a lake, the sun doesn't suddenly, sit in the middle of the soccer field outside my window. The world obeys certain rules, the rules of Newtonian physics. Of course, Newtonian physics is a way of talking lawfully about the way the world works. It's not here's the secret. It's here's a way of thinking about it that makes coherent what we're experiencing. But it's also the case, said Kant, that we are not simply bound to the natural world and our natural desires. So while it might be the case that we're simply party animals and spend our lives wishing to party and couple, and the drives are so powerful, if we were just part of the natural order of things, this would go on willy-nilly and we wouldn't think about it. But humans do think about it because humans have conscience, which means when we are contemplating a course of action that might overstep some bounds, we get this little that's it, which is the tweak of conscience, and that little negation points to a break from our embeddedness in the Newtonian scheme of action and reaction, and opens the prospect for a place in which we could act according to principles of our own fashioning. That's huge. What that means is that we are not any longer theonomos, given God laws given by God. It's autonomous, laws given by ourselves. We are no longer persons who are given the capacity to fulfill the law by God. We are persons who are given the capacity to fulfill the law by ourselves. So, Kant, who is sometimes referred to as a Pelagian, is hostile to Pelagius because Pelagius says, God gives us the law, we should be able to fulfill the law. Kant says, we gave ourselves the law, we give ourselves the capacity to fulfill the law. It's an entirely new world. What that means then is that when we talk theologically, we're not going back to the way that Pelagius talked. We're going to start instead with this experience of moral awareness, of conscience. And what that means is that in the moment, says Kant, in the very moment that we feel that we are free to act in a certain way, we are also aware implicitly that it's possible for the deeds that we are proposing to undertake to be realized. That means that when we act in the world, the effects of our actions are known in that world, alongside the effects of natural scheme of action and reaction effects, okay? So a moral effect is side by side with a natural effect. That means we've got a sense in which we've got two worlds bumping up against each other. And Kant says, when we think about moral conduct, we are thinking also about the God who holds those two worlds together, such that the effects of moral can spill over into the natural world. It's not a strict divide. That's a very important insight. The way we think of our world is different from the way the world is. The way we think of our world is the way that makes it possible for us to live in the world. A point, by the way, that was repeated endlessly by Freud. We have to think of the world in a way that's possible to live in, otherwise we couldn't live. The second point is, if we undertake a moral act, if we act according to principle, then we don't think that we're going to undertake that act and not complete it. It's rather that good deeds issue in good results. And so it must be the case that we're already aware that that result will happen, even if it's not in my lifetime. So that means that we're implicitly thinking about the immortality of the soul, which is the force to achieve this moral good. Now, if you think about theology that way, beginning with the moral awareness, then moral theology is different from theological morality. Theological morality, to go back to the example of Pelagius, God gives the law, God gives us the capacity to fulfill the law, therefore we do what God has told us to do. That would be theological morality. One example. There are lots of different examples, but the principle is it proceeds from God. We're told what to do, we're to do it. Kant thinks that that is dangerous. You'll see a little passage where he says that the symbol is the problem. The symbol is a word that was once used for the creed. He thinks you can't say in one generation what another generation is to believe. That's the whole drive behind enlightenment. Enlightenment is freedom from self-incurred minority. We can't be told by somebody before us how we're to think today. But we have the responsibility in our freedom to think clearly and deeply, not like this stuff that's going on in the world today, in the world domain of politics, which is divisive, hate-mongering, wholly irresponsible. It has no moral fiber whatsoever. And that is why Kant insists that in order for us to come of age, we must accept the public responsibility of acting morally, which is thinking clearly according to principles by which we are unified, not divided. So we've got the distinction between theological morality and moral theology. We have the distinction that's set up in enlightenment between being in our minority, having other people do our thinking, and coming into our own age, thinking for ourselves. That leads us right into Hegel, who says, yes, but this principle of moral conduct is always embodied in love. It cannot be understood as an individual thing. It is always interpersonal. That's the take home from that. So Jesus is the moral pedagogue who teaches about interpersonal love as the foundation of morality. Now, Schleiermacher says, look, the Kantian project, and even Hegel, is worthwhile and important, but it does have a confusion. It tends to think that it can talk about the way in which everything comes into being. and that we have full knowledge of the whole process. But in point of fact, there is the capacity that we have to know things. There is the capacity we have to do things. And there is a capacity we have of being affected by being in the world. You know, the sun's out today, so we're all a little brighter. During the last few weeks when it was gray, and rain, everybody's wandering around. All right? So tonality. That's what he's talking about. Tonality is your sense of connectedness to the all. Tonality is your sense of connectedness to the all. And what that means for him is, that's the way we talk about piety. Your sense of connectedness to the all. Think Calvin. Your sense of connectedness to the all. Now, because he's a good Kantian, Schleiermacher will say, the whole point is, you don't know what that all is. What you know instead is that there's being, sein, and there's somehow having come to be, irgendwie geworden sein. Lovely German word for saying somehow having come into being. And it's the somehow having come into being that gets forgotten. So we live in the world. We're having a fine time. We're caught up in sensible self-consciousness, but we forget the part that underlies it, of somehow having come into being. That awareness that we're dependent upon something other than ourselves. So when Schleiermacher talks about the feeling of absolute dependence, it's not a feeling, go out and ring a bell and it sounds like the note C. It's talking about a tonality, an awareness of your connectedness to all that is. Now, if you're going to talk about this theologically, you can say it's easy to forget your connection to all that is. So you have God forgetfulness. Of course, you don't know it's God forgetfulness. Think Calvin. You're so lost, you don't know you're lost. You've forgotten so much, you don't even know you've forgotten. The figure of Christ. Christ is not the object of faith. Christ is the mediator of faith, meaning that a kind of utterly unique consciousness about our relationship to the all, to God, proceeds through him. So to be a follower of Christ is to be made aware again of what God, being in relation to God, is. So Christ is the second Adam, the new creation that mediates to us a sense of what it is to be in relation to God when we've forgotten. And once we know that we're in relation to God, we suddenly realize that we've forgotten what it is to be in relation to God. So God remembrance and God forgetfulness, consciousness of sin, consciousness of redemption, those are all connected around one theme. Are you aware of your connectedness to God or not? And in the Christian world, you're aware of your consciousness of relation to God because of the figure of Christ, through whom this distinctive new way of understanding God as love and forgiveness proceeded. When we pray then, and this is the last point, we do not have a wish list of how our Christmas stockings are to be stuffed. Our prayer is simple. Let my will be aligned with yours. Let God consciousness permeate my being so that I am attuned to the all and therefore doing the will of God. I hope that helps. Have a good morning.